Hello, everyone. I'm Emily. I'm one of the co-founders of ATX Television Festival, and we're so glad you're joining us this weekend, especially for this next conversation. We've been partnering with the ACLU for the past couple of years, really to help us craft conversations that we feel are really important and we want to bring a spotlight to. And this year is no different. So we're very proud to be partnering on this conversation on voter suppression and the census. They are incredibly important issues every year, but especially in an election year. So we are honored that Dale Ho will be joining us to moderate this panel. Dale is from the ACLU. So Dale, come on up.
Hi, I'm Dale Ho. I'm the director of the Voting Rights Project at the American Civil Liberties Union, which means I oversee our lawsuits around the country that try to make sure that everyone can vote and that everyone gets counted equally in our political process. And I'm delighted to be here today to moderate this panel on voter suppression and election year issues. We've got a terrific panel of folks here, and I just want to introduce them one by one. First is Razan Ghalayini, who is a producer and director with Frontal, Samantha B.
Hello, thanks for having me, Dale.
Hi. Next is Marjan Safinia, a director producer of She Could Be Next.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Hi, thanks. Beau Willimon, creator, showrunner, producer, and president of WGA East.
Hi, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
And finally, Mike Royce, showrunner, co-creator, and executive producer of One Day at a Time.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Thank you all so much for joining this panel today. I want to start with a couple of questions about voter suppression, an issue that I spent a lot of time working on, and I know that some of you have addressed in some of your work. And I want to start with Razan, actually, if I could. I know that voter suppression and election year issues sort of generally are a huge focus of what you've been covering on Full Frontal. The circumstances of this year's election have obviously changed pretty dramatically. Now, as someone who's writing and producing and directing segments normally in the field, which is something that you can't do right now, what are you thinking about? What are you thinking about covering right now, and how has the pandemic changed your ability to do that work?
Well, I think first of all, we're all just like hoping there is a November, and that assuming we get there, there is an election. And assuming we get there, the election isn't contested after it happens. But like a lot of what we're thinking about really seriously is how to elevate voters of color and the voices of people of color in marginalized communities, and centering the conversation around that, because it seems like whatever efforts are going to be taken in order to suppress a vote, it's not really going to be towards the soccer moms in Iowa as much as the folks that are in the suburbs of Georgia or, upstate in New York or wherever. And so what we've really been trying to do is partner and concentrate our energies and talking with folks like Reverend Barber, Stacey Abrams, Fair Fight, and like allow them to sort of lead us and lead our show's editorial decisions and how we cover this issue, because we know so many people put in so much more work, like you, than a bunch of idiot comedians on 57th Street. So we're trying to provide our voices and jokes to elevate the messages of the people on the ground doing the work. That said, I don't know, a lot of our work is so much like going to the battleground states. Like the last shoot I was on was actually Super Tuesday. And we went down to North Carolina, and that feels like 58 years ago now. But not being able to like go and film is going to like definitely present a challenge. But I think we're all like holding on to some sliver of hope that maybe in November there will be a tiny bit of normalcy and we'll be able to film outside and go to some polling stations. But if not that, then I think we're just definitely going to talk to people who are working on mail ballots and talking to the organizers who are undertaking that giant I don't know how they're going to do it, but I'm here to support.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how folks who do voter registration work and get out the vote work are going to do what they normally do. I mean, this is a time of year when normally, there's huge voter registration drives happening. And obviously none of that is happening right now. So how we're going to get folks registered to vote, and then to get out the vote work too, it's a whole new world.
And I feel like it's going to be ever changing as they go on, like every week. I don't know, maybe they're like every week is completely different. There's a new obstacle. So I feel like they're definitely the people that we're trying to watch, and they're the stories we're trying to tell.
I want to put a question to Marjan, if I could. I know the second part of your upcoming docuseries on PBS, and She Be Next, focuses on a number of coalitions in Georgia, female-led, working to fight against voter suppression during the 2018 midterms in particular. Obviously, I don't want you to give too much away about the docuseries, but if you wouldn't mind telling us just a little bit about what you observed, what were some of the voter suppression tactics that people were telling you about that you saw in 2018 and that we might see again this year?
Sure. Well, not to spoil anything, but there was a lot of voter suppression in Georgia in 2018. Our series has a broader lens. Our series is about a movement of women of color across the country as candidates and organizers who are working to transform American democracy to be truly inclusive of the new American majority. So we followed a series of candidates and the organizers around them. And in Georgia, we were following Stacey Abrams and Lucy McBath, as well as the indomitable Nsé Ufot from the New Georgia Project and a host of other organizers. And so we started telling our story at the beginning of 2018. And our story is really about the changing face of America and the lack of a reflective democracy. But what we didn't, we weren't looking for a voter suppression story. We found ourselves in the middle of one. So, for me, I've lived in the United States many, many years, but I'm a multiple immigrant. And in 2016, I actually became an American so that I could vote for the first time. So I'm quite new to the kind of voting system in the US. And I live in California where we have good voter laws. And so my jaw was on the ground, honestly, in Georgia. The amount of stories that we encountered from random people that we would meet at events. We weren't out hunting for these stories. They were just sort of coming at us. And it's a host of things. It's a whole, I think Stacey does it very well, right? It's a whole series of small things that each one of them in and of themselves may not be that egregious, but when they're tied together as a system by design, then it's clearly a network of voter suppression. What I heard a lot was suppression by 1,000 cuts, right? So it was from every stage of it, from registration, which actually is happening right now. I just saw a tweet from John Ossoff, who's running for Senate, that he sent in his reg a month ago to Fulton County, and he still hasn't gotten it back, right? So from the registration end of things, loads of people not getting their registrations back, people being purged from the rolls, to a lot of the cases that your Atlanta folks from the ACLU brought around exact match, which is ludicrous, that if there's a gap in your name or a hyphen in your name and it doesn't match your driver's license identification, then you're put in this kind of limbo. And of course, all of these things outsize affect women and people of color and immigrants. In Georgia, one of the biggest explosions of immigrant populations are the Asian American population. And there's a great scene in our film where there's a Vietnamese activist trying to help a grandma go vote. And, her name is Jan. She has a 4-part name. And on the form, there's 3 boxes on English language forms, right? So it's just a whole system and network. And then, of course, on voting day, electronic voting, no power cords, machines that were changing. We heard over and over again about machines that would change the vote. So someone would hit for Stacey Abrams, they'd come to page forward, and then the machine would switch the vote to Brian Kemp. And we heard that from dozens of people, including Andrea Young's husband, apparently, who it happened to, the director of the ACLU of Georgia.
I want to shift gears a little bit and just talk about how you all are approaching kind of your creative processes, what you're working on. as artists in a very, very contentious election year, and that's obviously even before the pandemic hit and sort of scrambled everything. And I want to put a question to Beau, if I could. I know your career has, been really diverse in terms of the different kinds of things that you've worked on: screenwriting, playwriting, campaign work, activist causes, creating the Action Network. What do you see as, someone who has your hand in a lot of different pots, your role as someone with these different kinds of creative platforms and political experience? What do you see as your role in an election year, kind of generally, and then in this one in particular?
Well, my personal role is not really as important as our collective role. And of course, our collective role is comprised of a lot of individuals, each of us asking, what can we do with our means, our access to power, our privilege in order to affect change? So first of all, I want to thank the other panelists and yourself as well, Dale, for all of the incredibly important work that you guys do to try to correct a lot of wrongs. I mean, bottom line is we don't have functioning democracy. And one can make the argument that we've never had. But there have been efforts over the course of our history to course correct, whether you're looking at amendments passed in the 19th century, or women's suffrage, or the Voting Rights Act, and other similar legislation. On the whole, we have been attempting as a nation to move towards a more functioning democracy. And what we've seen in the last few decades is a dismantling of a lot of important work that's been done. And in that dismantling, a very robust and active effort to implement policy and laws and regulations that just simply make it harder for people to vote. That, along with gerrymandering, means that we have minority rule in this country, and not minority in terms of demographics based on race or ethnicity or other marginalized groups, but minority just simply insofar as there are fewer people that don't represent the majority of the electorate are having a disproportionate amount of representation in our government. So look, I mean, I wear a few hats. I mean, I'm a private citizen, so there are things I can do in terms of donating, in terms of marching, in terms of making calls, and all of the various things that any private citizen can do. I'm the president of the Writers Guild of America East, which is a labor union. And we're a particular type of union insofar as we represent storytellers and also journalists. And so there's been a lot that we've been trying to tackle in terms of better representation in the storytelling we do, affecting legislation to increase the work for women and people of color in our own industry through state legislation in New York and beyond. And when it comes to voting, there's a lot we can do to try to help with get out the vote efforts. When it comes to voter suppression itself, we, like any union that has a political stance, will call upon our members in order to try to advocate. And then as a storyteller, I've written a lot about politics, and I think, a general sense of heightening consciousness about the issues we face is always important in order to generate action. Unfortunately, a lot of people think that gerrymandering or voter suppression are not very sexy issues for storytelling. They can be complex at times, and nuance is always a challenge when you're trying to tell stories that appeal to a broad audience. And yet, I think we must try. We have to tell the stories of people that are trying to overcome voter suppression. We have to highlight and expose the stories of people who are doing everything they can to dismantle our democracy. We have to look at our role as storytellers as a way to reflect the world around us. And the world around us is one in which a lot of people are being disenfranchised. I think that there's still a long way to go in that regard, but certainly more and more those stories are being told directly or indirectly. And so, there's a lot of different fronts on which people can be effective. I try to do what I can on as many of them as I can. Never feels like enough, and it won't feel like enough until we correct a lot of these wrongs. But we gotta keep trying.
what you said about storytelling makes me think of a question that I know I wanted to ask Mike when I saw the list of panelists. And just a question about sort of telling stories about how we personally deal with in our personal and family relationships the really difficult issues that this year's election, I think, raises. So I've been told that that One Day at a Time has an upcoming animated special focusing on discussing the election with family members who aren't on the same page, and I guess I'm fortunate. My immediate family, I don't have to have any of those hard conversations with. My parents are, pretty in line with where I am politically. My in-laws might be a different story. But I just want to ask you, Mike, were you always planning on having a story about those kinds of issues this year? Was it the pandemic that sort of gave you the idea for the animated aspect of it? I just want to give you a chance to talk about it a little bit.
Sure. Thank you. Yes, we will solve all this with cartoons, I think is my answer. We had written an episode. We got to shoot 6 episodes before we got shut down. And we had an episode that we were very excited about, written already, about the difficulty of talking to your relatives who think differently than you on the other side of the aisle, or whatever you want to call it. But the importance of it. And this was all drafted off of my partner, Gloria Calderon-Kellett's situation in her family. She's a Cuban American who's, generally speaking, pretty liberal on the left side, but she has relatives, Cuban American relatives, who are very conservative, and she's had difficult conversations with them and trying to kind of come to some kind of even an agree to disagree situation. And we got talking about that in the writer's room, and we were really drawn to, with the election coming up, trying to illustrate how that discussion might go. And it was a really interesting writing challenge because, of course, now we're just all talking about politics and everyone's jumping on their issues and and we're all sounding like the semi-informed Hollywood writers that we are, talking about whatever we read in the newspaper that day and blah, 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 blah. But we didn't want it to sound, we didn't want to do a sitcom version of Crossfire, we couldn't be conservative versus liberal and like us just sort of trying to make jokes about that, because you see that every night on a lot of shows that are funnier than us. So what we realized the story should be is the discussion about how to talk about it, because there's so many different approaches. And then at the end of the episode, it gets much more real. So we designed this episode, again, it was supposed to be live action to start with, that was all about strategizing and would pop to all these fantasy sequences about what if, basically at first trying to avoid the issue, and what if we're just polite, and what if, I don't want to spoil it for everybody, but all these various approaches. And then we popped to kind of how that would work out. And we had already decided not to shoot it in front of an audience because there were so many, logistically speaking, it wouldn't have worked. We had so many fantasy sequences to do it. It just would have. So when this all happened, Gloria realized, well, that actually lends itself pretty nicely to animation. And that got kicked off, and this company in Canada called Smiley Guy, which is an animation house, kicked into gear, and they put together, we've all put together, and they, doing all the legwork, have done this amazing job in basically 8 weeks in making an animated version of the episode. And actually, I just saw the almost final cut yesterday, and I'm so excited, because what was born of just the pandemic and let's do another episode, and we wanted to make sure, because it had to do the election, we were really afraid if we're not able to come back, that it would be after the election that we could shoot it live action wise. So, it was born out of just like frustration and just being able to like make the episode. But stylistically, it's really come together really, really nicely, and we're very excited about it coming out.
Great. I know these conversations are happening in a lot of families. It's difficult, and I normally kind of try to diffuse things in my own life with humor, but nothing seems funny right now. It's hard to laugh about what's happening in this country, but that brings me kind of back to Razan here, because obviously you don't have the choice of working in different kinds of genres. I mean, how do you still manage to not lose sight of humor and actually, to write comedy in this kind of environment, with, the worst pandemic in a century, the worst, response to protests about racial injustice that we've seen in a generation, and layered on top of an economic collapse? I mean, none of this, seems funny right now. How do you manage?
It's definitely not funny. But we also, I think there's we did an interview with Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley yesterday, and she said something that I feel like is a better answer than what we could say. But she said to Sam, it's our duty to celebrate our life and find joy with the same enthusiasm and dedication that we do to fight the injustices that are in front of us. And so I think we've been trying to, take her wisdom and kind of use that to inform the work that we do at the show, while giving everybody space to you know what, if you can't do the Zoom joke meeting today, that's fine. Please, don't come. Take the time and be and do what you need to do. And we try really hard to focus on finding comedy in spaces that are silly. I think a fart joke goes a long way right now. Nobody is trying to and I think the other big part of it is finding ways to make the comedy about us and about how we can laugh at what we don't know. In some ways, that's a really good way to kind of create moments of teaching and learning in the show, which is obviously part of late night comedy. But yeah, I think everybody is just trying to find anything funny. Yesterday, our Slack blew up because we found an article saying that there are these K-pop fans who are flooding the police feeds, and we were just this is so funny. This is just objectively funny. So there are things you can hang your hat on to make a joke that are still positive. They're still about the movement, and they're still not punching down. And I think generally everybody's trying really hard to not talk about Trump because he talks about himself enough. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's sort of what we're trying to do. Yeah.
I want to take a quick detour though from the election, and it's still within the realm of voting rights and current events, and talk about an issue that's near to my heart, the census. I argued a case in the Supreme Court about a year ago about the Trump administration trying to put a citizenship question on the census, which we knew was going to absolutely wreck the count and result in a huge undercount in communities of color, areas with large numbers of immigrants, screw up the allocation of seats in the House, result in a misallocation of $900 billion in federal funds annually, and then you would just see political power as the numbers went down in urban diverse areas relative to white rural areas. Just see the power flowing to those places to try to stave off the electoral consequences of the demographic changes that the country is experiencing. But since Beau mentioned the issue of sexy topics, I thought I'd come to Mike, who actually wrote an episode about the census. I had a hard time just kind of explaining this issue to my friends and family. How did you get the idea to write an episode of One Day at a Time about the census? I mean, was it always going to be the opener for the season? And what was sort of the reaction like in the writer's room?
Well, to be clear, we just ran the questions. There was no jokes. No, it's the opening of the show. The whole, it frames the episode, but the cold open, which is pretty long for a cold open, is all about, it's a census taker comes by, played by Ray Romano. So that was a good excuse to have a celebrity come into the house. it was born, honestly, out of a need to reintroduce the family to our new network, which is the Pop network. We went from Netflix to Pop. So we were sort of scrambling for what would be a good way to do that. And then we were talking about the census, and Vincent Brown, who's a writer in the room, said, well, actually, why don't we have the census taker come, visit them? And then they're literally introducing themselves to the guy and telling their information, and for comedy reasons, completely oversharing about themselves. But then we were able to make it sneak in some really important stuff. Actually, the thing you were just talking about. So some of the, and in the Latino community, it's as all the things you're talking about, there's suspicion, there's people who don't want to participate. And we felt like it was a great message to get out to kind of illustrate how that might go down a little bit inside of an apartment of a Cuban American family. So, he knocks on the door and she opens the door and she says, I'm from the census. She slams the door in his face. The daughter comes, Elena comes in and was like, what are you doing? And it's funny because we had kind of a joke line about Penelope saying oh, maybe it could be the census strangler or something that was just a joke basically. And we changed it to just her saying, a guy who wants a list of Latinos on my house, no thank you, which was a straight line, but still got a huge laugh because it's yes, that's the real fear. I don't need that in my house. And Elena convinces her to open the door, and we show the importance of the information. And we made a special point of Lydia, who's the grandmother on the show, became a citizen in season 2. She had gotten her green card, but never became an American citizen. So she shares that information, and that allows the census taker to say, oh, actually, I don't need to know that. All you need to tell me is this, this, this. And we made an explicit point of trying to, demystify, and debunk basically that information, as well as some other things. So we were very proud of it, and we're actually going to try and make that scene available. Obviously it has other things going on in it, but it's a pretty tight kind of, it takes you through just a few of the stumbling blocks that you might have in your head about why I don't want to participate in the census. And we want to try and make it available on a wider basis, just to have for people to, see.
I think that would be great. I mean, we're way behind in terms of census participation right now because of the pandemic. I mean, right now, in 2010, we would have had several months of census workers out there in the field making sure that we get an accurate count. And just for those who don't know, I kind of glossed over this, but states get representation in Congress based on their head count, just total numbers of people, and election districts are drawn based on the population count from the census. And if you're not counted, you just poof, you just vanish from that national head count. And I think on April 1st, Census Day of this year, we were at about 34% household participation nationwide. In 2010, on April 1st, we were at 50%. So we're off 16 points. That's where we started. We can't send census workers out into the field. The one good thing, though, is that, you can fill out the census online now. It's easier than it's ever been. So, I think that will hopefully help close the gap a little bit.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention it because I was talking to Gloria before this, and she was on a Zoom with Stacey Abrams, which I was very jealous of. And she made the point that it's a lot of people are fearful that I don't want people to have my information. I want the government to have my information. And I guess Stacey Abrams made the point about they kind of are. If you have a cell phone, if you have your information, for better or for worse, the government probably, they know about you. So now you're just sharing information that will get you power with the census.
It's true, with our cell phones and with social media, it's we're giving out our personal data kind of left and right, just making it rain everywhere. I want to ask just a couple more questions about what folks can do, what you've learned from your work, what folks can do this election season going forward. And I want to come back to Marjan with a question about that. I mean, from working on And She Could Be Next, what do you think sort of just the average viewer can learn about from the women who are the subjects of your documentary about empowering their communities, combating voter suppression, making change happen?
It's not about the candidates. It's about us. Nobody is coming to save us. We are our country. We are our government, right? We are our leaders. And that's the heart of the message, is that there's an organizer in all of us. One of the things that really I found so moving when we were making this film is the number of undocumented Americans who were at the forefront of doing voter engagement work, because for them, they can't go and vote at the ballot box. This is the way that they get a say in the shape of the country. And I think that when we look at what's happening on our streets, you know, there is a justice problem in this country, right? And we are crying out for systems that reflect us, because we don't look like what we looked like before as a country. And so I think that, you know, I reject the idea that it's not sexy. The census isn't sexy. I think what you do, Dale, is super sexy. I think that people like you are our superheroes. I think we need to reframe who our superheroes are. I think that COVID has shown us that some of the celebrities that we think are so awesome really look like us when they're hanging around in their bathrobes making pancakes, right? And the real people who are inspiring us are the ones who are on the street and who are leading movement. And so, you know, we have a sort of a mantle, which is, like I said, an organizer in all of us, and we all have to get involved. So everyday people, we just need to plug in. It's, no, we get to shape the country that we live in, and we do that with our active participation. And voting is like the floor for that, right? But connecting yourself to a political home, finding a political organization that represents something that looks like you. They exist all over the country. Educating yourself, signing up for a bunch of emails and Facebook pages for the people who are elected to represent you, going to boring meetings in, you know, fluorescent lighting rooms. Now you can do them online, so that you understand where are the decisions being made and how do we participate and bring our voice to that.
Well, in the same vein, I just want to ask Beau one more question. And you touched on this when you were speaking earlier about what, you know, people can do, what ordinary folks can do. You talked about sort of what you think you can do as a citizen. But I want to ask specifically as a storyteller. I mean, all four of you are storytellers, but I just want to put this question to Beau. As a storyteller, and given the limitations that folks have right now because of the pandemic, how do you think we can tell stories right now? And what are the kinds of stories that you wish were being told right now, you know, as we get closer to November? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. I'll try not to bore you to tears with them. I want to go, you talked about comedy a little bit earlier. You know, I just think it's important to remember that the whole reason we want to fix the system is so that people can live better lives. We want to celebrate life, right? And laughter and joy and love are so important right now. It is, you're right, a lot of the subject matter isn't funny, but life is funny. Life is filled with joy. We have to show that. We have to laugh at these times. I mean, if you look at some of the, you know, revolutions of the past few decades elsewhere in the globe, yes, you see clashes with authorities, but you also see people dancing and singing. Here in New York, I've seen protesters stand up in front of a cordon of police and dance. You know, it makes it a lot harder for a police officer to attack you when you're dancing. You know, there's great power to sharing laughter and joy and love with one another. And that is a contribution, even if it's not directly telling the story of political injustice, right? Because what you're saying is this person's story matters, right? And so, you know, look, in terms of the stories that we need to be telling right now, I mean, there's so many stories being told, you know, and a lot of it is happening with these things, you know. We're seeing people on the streets. We're seeing people share their voice from home if they can't be on the streets. We're we're seeing documentary type story being told by the average citizen that people with platforms are amplifying, that when they have something meaningful to say, they're telling their own story and we're helping to get it out there. There's a lot of stuff we can do in Hollywood on the scripted side, shaping stories and sort of absorbing and crafting and thinking about having a meaningful impact. But we should also be paying a lot of attention to the many stories that are being told every single day, good, bad, and ugly, and doing everything we can to amplify those. What sort of story should be told? I don't have the authority to answer that question fully. The whole point of having a lot of storytellers out in the world and also working towards a more inclusive and equitable industry is so that a lot of people are answering that question, because we all have our blind spots. We all have our ingrained prejudices and biases. We all have stories that we can speak, with authority on, and then many stories where we need to be an audience, So I guess as maybe general and abstract, maybe unsatisfying as the answer sounds, it's not about which stories we're telling. It's that we need to be telling all stories, and every avenue towards that, whether it's a late night comedy show, whether it's, an hour-long drama, whether it's a sitcom, whether it's Sarah Cooper taking Donald Trump and completely highlighting the absurdity of him in a way that makes you laugh despite how terrible it is that, whatever he happens to be saying. Every time one of those stories is told, or we can co-opt a story and make it our own in a way that is speaking truth to power, that is a way of exhibiting power, right? And let's face it, storytelling is about power. All things really are boiled down to power, right? Your lack of it, your expression of it, what you're going to do in order to obtain it, how other people are going to keep you from having it. And we're looking for just, telling stories and celebrating the power of the human spirit, of individual dignity, and just the act of speaking, of storytelling, of someone standing up millions of years ago at the campfire and saying, I have something to share, right, is a powerful act in of itself. So I encourage anyone watching this, not just to be thinking about what script should I be writing, but what is every avenue I have to tell a story right now? And as important, perhaps even more important, what am I doing to amplify other people's stories?
Thank you so much for that, Beau. So that's all the time that we have. I really enjoyed this conversation. This is not what I normally do during my day job, so it was a lot of fun for me. I hope you all enjoyed it too. I just want to thank all four of you, Beau, Razan, Marjan, Mike. Thanks a lot for joining us.